My name is Vivian Sterling. I am 45 years old, and for the last 12 years, I have served as the silent, invisible architect of the Sterling family's prestige while being treated like the help. Apologize to your sister for your disgusting attitude or find a hotel. You're suffocating the holiday spirit. My mother, Eleanor, spat those words out with a cold, surgical precision that cut deeper than any blade, her voice echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings of the estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. The air in the dining room was thick with the scent of a 20-pound heritage breed turkey and the expensive musk of Joe Malone candles. But all I could smell was the metallic tang of blood from where my sister, Cassandra, had just struck me. My left ear was still ringing, a high-pitched whine that muffled the sounds of 30 relatives shifting uncomfortably in their seats. These people, my aunts, uncles, and cousins, sat paralyzed around the 24-foot solid mahogany table, their fingers white-knuckled as they clutched their $65 Waterford crystal wine glasses filled with a 2018 Chateau Montelena Chardonnay that I had personally paid for. I looked at my mother, whose face remained a mask of aristocratic disappointment, her skin pulled tight by a recent $15,000 facelift I had financed under the guise of a wellness retreat. To her right, Cassandra was dabbing at a non-existent tear with a Belgian linen napkin, the candlelight catching the sparkle of the 2-carat diamond studs I had gifted her for her birthday last June. The irony was a physical weight in my chest. I am a lead forensic accountant, a woman who spends her professional life unearthing hidden debts, tracking laundered millions, and exposing the rot beneath polished balance sheets. Yet, in this room, I was the only one who saw the absolute bankruptcy of our family's soul. For over a decade, I had been the family's private bank, the one who quietly settled the liens on this very house, the one who paid off Cassandra's spiraling credit card debts to Neiman Marcus and Saks Fifth Avenue so our parents wouldn't have to face the shame of a daughter in collections. The disgusting attitude my mother referred to was simply my refusal to sign over another $40,000 to cover the shortfall in Cassandra's failed boutique venture in downtown Greenwich. I had reached my limit. I sat there, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for my own glass, the movement feeling heavy and slow as if I were underwater. I looked down at the table setting, noticing the way the light reflected off the polished silver, crystal mood flatware that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. My name is Vivian Sterling, and on this night, amidst the opulence I had sustained with my own sweat and 80-hour work weeks, I realized I was a stranger at my own table. Now, let me take you back to how the evening began, before the blow and the ultimatum, to the moment I pulled my 2024 slate gray Porsche Cayenne Turbo e-hybrid into the circular cobblestone driveway. The tires crunched on the fresh gravel, a $3,000 delivery I'd ordered last week because my father complained the old stones looked weathered. I had arrived with 3 crates of premium wine and a stack of luxury gift bags from Bergdorf Goodman, my mind already calculating the tax implications of the charitable donations my father would inevitably ask me to handle before the year ended. I walked through the double oak doors, the familiar scent of expensive wood polish and my mother's Chanel No. 5 hitting me like a wall. The house was a sprawling 6-bedroom colonial, a monument to a legacy that was crumbling behind the scenes. My father, Julian, was standing by the fireplace, swirling a glass of 30-year-old Macallan. He looked every bit the retired executive, but I knew the truth. I knew his pension had been gutted by bad investments in 2019 and that the property taxes on this estate, amounting to nearly $52,000 annually, were being paid from a sub-account I managed. He nodded at me, a brief, dismissive gesture, before turning back to Cassandra's husband, Marcus, who was bragging about a new boat he couldn't afford. Dinner had started with an orchestrated grace that belied the tension. We moved to the dining room at exactly 7 p.m. The centerpiece was an elaborate arrangement of white peonies and silver-sprayed eucalyptus that trailed down the center of the mahogany. As the first course, a lobster bisque drizzled with white truffle oil was served by the catering staff I had hired for $300 an hour. The conversation turned, as it always did, to Cassandra's needs. "Vivian," my mother said, her voice dropping into that sweet, manipulative register she saved for financial requests. Cassandra was telling us about the expansion for the boutique. It's such a vibrant opportunity, but the bank is being so tedious with the paperwork. We thought you could just bridge the gap. It's a drop in the bucket for someone in your position. I kept my head down, focusing on the way the soup spoon felt in my hand. I thought about my office in the city, the spreadsheets that showed Cassandra had lost over $200,000 of my money in 3 years. I thought about the late nights I spent auditing hedge funds while she was taking inspirational trips to Tulum on my dime. "I'm not doing it, Mother," I said quietly. The clinking of silverware stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so profound I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Cassandra's face transformed from performative sweetness to raw, jagged entitlement. "What do you mean you're not doing it? You have the money, Viv. You're the lead something or other. You're rich. Why are you being so selfish? It's family. I've given you $212,000 in 36 months, Cassandra," I replied, my voice gaining a hardness that came from years of staring down corporate fraudsters. "That isn't an investment. It's a black hole, and I'm not pouring another cent into it." That was when she snapped. She stood up so quickly her heavy mahogany chair scraped against the hardwood floor with a screech that set my teeth on edge. Before I could react, she reached across the corner of the table and struck me across the face with the back of her hand. The force of it knocked my head to the side, my earring catching in her ring, tearing my lobe just enough to send a trickle of warmth down my neck. My wine glass tipped, the pale yellow liquid soaking into the $5,000 hand-embroidered tablecloth like a spreading bruise. I didn't scream. I didn't even gasp. I just sat there, the left side of my face throbbing, the ringing in my ear beginning its long, steady drone. I looked at my father, expecting him to roar in my defense, to demand an apology for the violence in his home. Instead, he just looked away, staring intensely at a painting of a fox hunt on the far wall. Then came my mother's voice, cold as an Arctic wind, delivering the ultimatum that changed everything. "Apologize to your sister for your disgusting attitude or find a hotel. You're suffocating the holiday spirit." I looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the desperation behind her polished exterior. She wasn't defending Cassandra. She was defending the flow of money. She was defending the facade. If I stopped paying, the house would go. The cars would go. The $65 wine glasses would be sold at an estate auction. I felt a strange sense of clarity wash over me, a chilling calm that usually only came when I found the missing decimal point in a multi-million-dollar fraud case. I reached into my leather handbag, which sat on the floor beside my chair. It was a black Hermes Birkin 35, a gift to myself for closing a major case last year. I pulled out my phone, a titanium-framed device, and tapped the screen. "The holiday spirit," I repeated, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked around the table at the 30 relatives who had enjoyed my largesse for a decade. None of them met my eyes. "Is that what we're calling it? This orchestrated theft?" I stood up, pushing my chair back slowly. I felt the sting in my ear intensify, a sharp, pulsing heat. I walked toward the head of the table where my father sat. I took a deep breath, the scent of the roasting turkey now nauseatingly sweet. "There will be no apology," I said, looking directly at my mother. "And I don't need a hotel. I own a 3-bedroom penthouse on the Upper West Side that is fully paid for. I have a life that doesn't involve being a human ATM for people who don't even like me." I turned to my father. "Dad, the property tax bill for this quarter is due on the 15th. It's $52,481. I've canceled the automatic transfer from my account. And Cassandra, the lease on your boutique space is in my name. I've already sent the termination notice to the landlord. You have 30 days to vacate." The silence in the room shifted from awkward to panicked. My mother's hand went to her throat, her fingers fumbling with the pearl necklace I'd bought her for their 40th anniversary. Cassandra's eyes went wide, the rage replaced by a sudden, sharp realization of what was happening. I didn't wait for them to find their voices. I turned and walked out of the dining room, my heels clicking sharply on the marble floors of the foyer. I didn't grab my coat. I didn't grab the gift bags I'd brought. I just walked out into the cold Connecticut night. The air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and the incoming winter. I climbed into the driver's seat of the Cayenne, the leather smelling of luxury and safety. I gripped the steering wheel, my hands finally starting to shake. I looked at the house one last time. The glowing windows, the silhouette of the massive Christmas tree in the parlor, the sprawling architecture of a lie I had been telling myself for 12 years. I put the car in gear and drove down the cobblestone driveway, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I was 45 years old, I was bleeding from my left ear, and I was officially no one's daughter. But as I reached the main road and headed toward the city, the ringing in my ear finally began to fade, replaced by a silence that felt, for the first time in a very long time, like peace. Family isn't blood. Family isn't the name on a birth certificate or the people who sit at your table once a year to toast to their own vanity. Family is the people who don't hit you when you say no. Family is the people who see your worth when you aren't writing them a check. I had spent 12 years buying a seat at a table where I was never truly welcome, and as the lights of the Greenwich estate disappeared in my rearview mirror, I realized that the most expensive thing I had ever paid for was the courage to finally walk away. For over a decade, I have allowed myself to be cast as the cold, career-driven villain in the Sterling family play, a role I accepted because I thought it was the price of admission for their love. I am Vivian Sterling, and while my family viewed my meticulous nature and my grueling 80-hour work weeks as a lack of personality, those very traits allowed me to manage the silent collapse of their dignity. I live in a modest 800-square-foot condo in a quiet, tree-lined street in Brooklyn, a space filled with the scent of high-end espresso and the hushed silence of someone who actually works for their living. My walls are adorned with simple, functional art, and my furniture is high quality but understated, because I have never felt the need to perform my wealth. Meanwhile, I have spent the last 6 years subsidizing my sister's $4,100 a month lifestyle in a luxury glass-walled loft in Manhattan's West Village, a space that drips with the kind of performative opulence that only someone else's money can buy. My sister Cassandra is 31 years old and brands herself as a spiritual influencer, a title that effectively translates to her spending my hard-earned money on aura cleanses and vintage silk robes while she tells her 50,000 followers how to manifest abundance from the universe. Every time I see her, she is wearing the $6,200 Cartier Tank Française watch that I bought her 3 years ago, a gift she demanded as a necessary investment in her brand to attract high-net-worth clients for her life coaching retreats. It sits on her wrist, a shimmering reminder of my own stupidity, ticking away seconds that I spent in windowless conference rooms auditing the tax returns of multinational corporations just so she could feel successful. She doesn't see the irony of preaching about the energy of the universe while her electricity bill, her high-speed fiber-optic internet, and her membership at the Equinox Hudson Yards are all automatically debited from a business account I established and funded. The Thanksgiving dinner that ended in a physical assault was not an anomaly, but the culmination of years of financial and emotional parasitism. I paid for every single item that graced that mahogany table, down to the very last grain of Himalayan sea salt. I remember the weight of the invoices as I reviewed them in my home office, the $1,550 organic catering bill from a boutique chef in Westport, who insisted on sourcing heritage turkeys that lived more pampered lives than most humans. I paid for the $400 artisan sourdough bread service, which arrived in rustic wooden crates lined with linen, and even the $90 a bottle Pinot Noir that my Uncle Robert poured down his throat like it was tap water. I sat there watching them consume my labor, listening to them discuss their upcoming winter vacations to Aspen and St. Bart's, knowing full well that their travel points were accumulated on credit cards that I had cleared of debt just 6 months prior. They didn't see Vivian, the woman who had missed her own best friend's wedding because she was finishing a forensic audit that saved a nonprofit from bankruptcy. They didn't see the woman who woke up at 4:30 a.m. every morning to run 6 miles just to burn off the stress of being the secret foundation of a crumbling dynasty. To them, I was nothing more than a 401k with a pulse, a faceless entity that existed to ensure the lights stayed on and the wine stayed chilled. They treated my career as a tedious hobby that happened to produce gold coins, never once stopping to ask if I was tired or if I actually enjoyed the life I had built. When I looked around the room, past the flickering candles and the expensive floral arrangements, I realized that my presence was only tolerated as long as my signature was on the checks. The contrast between my reality and their perception was a chasm that grew wider with every passing holiday. While I was analyzing complex financial structures to catch white-collar criminals, Cassandra was taking selfies in her loft, complaining that the sunlight wasn't hitting her crystals correctly. I remember the specific smell of the sourdough as it was sliced, the yeasty, fermented tang of a loaf that cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget, and the way my father praised the terroir of the wine without once acknowledging that it was my credit card that had been swiped at the vineyard. It was a masterclass in erasure. I was the ghost in the machine of their luxury, the invisible hand that caught them every time they tripped over their own greed. In my professional life, I am the one people fear. I am the lead forensic accountant who can find a hidden offshore account in a matter of hours and who can read a balance sheet like a roadmap to a crime scene. I have spent my career exposing people who take what they haven't earned. Yet for 12 years, I allowed my own family to commit the ultimate fraud against me. I let them convince me that because I was strong and successful, I was obligated to carry their weaknesses on my back. I bought into the narrative that Cassandra was the creative, sensitive soul who needed protection, while I was the hardened professional who didn't need anything from anyone. The realization hit me as I watched Cassandra sip her $90 wine. She didn't just want my money, she wanted my submission. She needed me to be the cold, unfeeling one so that she could be the vibrant, emotional center of the family. My parents enabled this dynamic because it was easier than facing the fact that their youngest daughter was a failure, and their oldest daughter was the only reason they weren't living in a 2-bedroom apartment in the suburbs. Every dollar I spent on their lifestyle was a brick in a wall that kept me separated from them. A wall I had helped build with my own misplaced sense of duty. As the evening progressed, before the blow was struck, I found myself staring at the Cartier watch on Cassandra's wrist. I calculated the hours of work it represented, the late-night flights to Chicago, the endless cups of lukewarm coffee in legal offices, the strain on my eyes from staring at spreadsheets until the numbers began to blur. That watch wasn't an investment in her brand. It was a shackle I had placed on my own wrist. I had been subsidizing my own devaluation. I had been paying for the privilege of being ignored. I thought about my modest condo in Brooklyn, with its white walls and its single, perfect leather chair where I read my books in the evening. I realized that my home was a sanctuary because it was the only place in the world where I wasn't being used. The Sterling estate, with its sprawling lawns and its mahogany-filled dining room, was a theater of the absurd, and I had been the sole financier of the production. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief, not for the money I had lost, but for the person I could have been if I hadn't spent a decade trying to buy a seat at a table that was already bought and paid for by my own blood and sweat. The air in the room felt stiflingly hot, the scent of the artisan bread and the expensive turkey becoming cloying and suffocating. I looked at the relatives clutching their crystal glasses, these people who would be the first to turn their backs if the money ever stopped flowing. I was the lead forensic accountant who had missed the biggest fraud of all, the one happening in my own family. I had been auditing the wrong lives. As I sat there, the cold, career-driven Vivian Sterling, I began to see the numbers clearly for the first time. The debt they owed me wasn't financial. It was a debt of respect, of kindness, and of basic human recognition, and I knew with a chilling certainty that they were absolutely insolvent. I realized then that my life had been a series of transactions where I was always the one providing the liquidity. I had paid for the sterling name to remain untarnished by the reality of their poor choices. I had paid for the illusion that we were a successful, happy family. But looking at Cassandra, with her $6,000 watch and her $30 aura spray, I saw the rot beneath the gilding. I saw that I was the only thing standing between them and the reality they so desperately feared. And in that moment, before she even raised her hand to strike me, I decided that the bank was closed. The investment had failed, and it was time for me to cut my losses and walk away from the bankruptcy of the Sterling soul. The final collapse of the Sterling family facade happened at exactly 7:14 p.m., a moment frozen in my mind like a crime scene photograph. We were midway through the second course of the Thanksgiving dinner I had financed, the air heavy with the scent of roasted root vegetables and the lingering notes of the expensive Pinot Noir, when Cassandra leaned back in her chair and smoothed the silk of her vintage robe. With a voice that carried the breezy nonchalance of someone who has never had to balance a checkbook or fear a late notice, she announced that she was liquidating our grandmother's vintage emerald necklace to fund a 3-month soul-searching expedition to the Waldorf Astoria in the Maldives. This wasn't just any piece of jewelry. It was a 1920s Art Deco masterpiece featuring a 5-carat Colombian emerald surrounded by baguette-cut diamonds, a piece that our grandmother, Beatrice, had explicitly left to me because she knew I was the only one who wouldn't pawn it for a temporary thrill. My pulse spiked as I felt the familiar heat of an audit taking place in my mind, calculating the sheer audacity of her plan to sell an heirloom I had legally inherited and which was currently protected under a deed of gift I had secured in my fireproof safe years ago. When I spoke, my voice was devoid of the emotion she wanted, replaced instead by the clinical, razor-sharp tone I used when uncovering offshore tax havens. I told her quite simply that the necklace was not hers to sell and that I held the legal title to it, a statement that caused the room to go silent as the 30 relatives froze with their silver forks suspended in midair. Cassandra's face contorted, her carefully cultivated spiritual persona evaporating to reveal a raw, jagged entitlement that was far more honest than her brand. She didn't argue the law or the ethics. She simply stood up with a violent suddenness that knocked a crystal water glass over, sending a cascade of ice and lemon slices across the mahogany table. Before I could even process the movement, she leaned across the table and slapped me with a force that felt like a physical explosion on the left side of my face. The impact was so precise and so brutal that it didn't just sting, it shattered the post of my $350 Mikimoto pearl earring, sending the jewel skittering across the hardwood floor like a discarded marble. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the high-pitched ringing in my left ear and the distant, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. I waited for the intervention that a daughter should expect from her father, looking toward Julian Sterling, the man whose mortgage I had secretly been paying for 24 months to keep him from the indignity of foreclosure. My father did not reprimand Cassandra. He did not ask if I was all right or demand that she apologize for the assault. Instead, he rose from his seat at the head of the table with a slow, deliberate movements that felt like a judge passing a sentence. He walked past me without a glance, his polished leather loafers clicking on the marble as he reached the heavy oak front door. He pulled it open, inviting the 28-degree Connecticut wind to howl into the foyer, the frigid air instantly clashing with the artificial warmth of the dining room. He looked at me with eyes that were as cold as the winter night outside and delivered the final blow. "If you can't be a sister, you can't be a guest. Leave," he said, his voice flat and final, as if he were discarding a faulty piece of equipment rather than his own flesh and blood. I stood up, the left side of my face beginning to swell and throb with a dull, rhythmic heat that matched the beating of my heart. I didn't reach for my wool coat that was draped over the banister, nor did I stop to gather the designer gift bags I had brought for everyone. I walked toward that open door, my heels sounding like gunshots on the cold stone floor, feeling the bite of the 28-degree air through my silk blouse as I stepped out into the darkness. I didn't look back to see my mother's reaction or to see if Cassandra was celebrating her victory. I simply stepped out into the night, the freezing wind whipping around me as the heavy oak door clicked shut with a finality that signaled the end of my life as a Sterling. I was 45 years old, standing in the driveway of a mansion I had sustained with my own blood and sweat, shivering in the cold without a jacket. And yet, for the first time in 12 years, I felt an incredible, weightless sense of relief. As I walked toward my Porsche, the gravel crunching under my feet, the physical pain in my ear was eclipsed by the absolute clarity of the betrayal. I thought about the deed of gift sitting in my safe, the document that proved I was the rightful owner of the emeralds, and I realized that my father wasn't just throwing me out, he was attempting to exile the truth. He chose the daughter who lived in a glass loft on my dime because she provided him with the illusion that the Sterling legacy was still vibrant and successful, whereas I was a constant reminder of the debt they could never repay. My name is Vivian Sterling, and as I sat in my car, turning the ignition and feeling the engine roar to life, I realized that the holiday spirit they accused me of suffocating was actually a suffocating cloud of lies that I was finally breathing my way out of. I gripped the leather steering wheel, my fingers numb from the cold, and watched the lights of the house in the rearview mirror as I drove away. They thought they had taken everything from me by casting me out into the winter, but in their greed and their arrogance, they had accidentally given me back my life. I drove down the winding roads of Greenwich, the heater in the car slowly thawing my frozen skin, but the coldness in my soul remained, a protective barrier that I knew would never truly disappear. I began to mentally audit the last decade, tallying every loan, every subsidized vacation, and every bill I had quietly disappeared. The total was staggering, a multi-million-dollar investment in a family that had just proven it was absolutely bankrupt of character. I thought about the Maldives trip Cassandra wanted, and I felt a dark, cold satisfaction knowing that when she tried to sell those emeralds, she would find herself facing the full weight of my legal department. I am a forensic accountant. I don't just find the money, I find the intent behind the money. And tonight, the intent of the Sterling family had been laid bare in the 28-degree wind. By the time I reached the highway heading toward the city, the swelling in my ear had worsened, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I realized that my father's ultimatum, that I couldn't be a guest if I wasn't a sister, was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. To them, being a sister meant being a source of capital, a silent partner in their delusions, and an endless well of forgiveness for their cruelty. If that was the definition of family, then I was more than happy to be a stranger. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, seeing the faint outline of Cassandra's handprint on my cheek, and I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a woman who had finally closed a bad account. I was Vivian Sterling, a woman of means, of intellect, and of formidable legal power, and as the skyline of Manhattan began to shimmer in the distance, I knew that the Sterling family was about to learn that when you kick the bank out into the cold, the bank doesn't just go away, it forecloses. The realization that I had walked out without my coat became a metaphor for my new existence. I had stripped away the layers of obligation and the heavy shroud of family loyalty that had been weighing me down for years. I was exposed, yes, but I was also free. I thought about my penthouse on the Upper West Side, a place they had never been invited to because I subconsciously knew they would only see it as another asset to be drained. I would arrive there tonight, I would ice my face, and tomorrow morning, I would begin the process of systematic financial withdrawal. Every automatic payment, every shared account, and every professional courtesy I had extended to my father's name would be severed with the same surgical precision my mother used to cut me out of the dinner. Family is often described as a safety net, but for me, it had become a noose, tightening every time I tried to stand up for my own worth. I spent years paying for the privilege of being ignored, thinking that if I just provided enough, they would eventually see the person behind the money. But as the freezing wind of Connecticut had taught me, some people only see you when they need to reach into your pockets. As I pulled into the garage of my building, the quiet luxury of my own space waiting for me, I realized that I didn't need their mahogany table or their $90 wine. I had built a world of my own, and tonight I had finally moved into it permanently. I was Vivian Sterling, 45, successful, and for the first time in my life, entirely and gloriously alone. The ringing in my ear was a small price to pay for the silence of a house where no one was asking me for a check. Family isn't blood. Family is the people who don't leave you standing in the wind. And as I stepped into the elevator, I knew that the only person who had truly stayed with me through the storm was the woman I had spent 12 years trying to hide. I pulled my 2024 slate gray Porsche Cayenne Turbo E-Hybrid, not a Volvo, but a vehicle far more representative of the cold, calculated success they so envied, into a deserted rest stop off I-95, the neon hum of a distant mobile sign casting a rhythmic, sickly blue light across the dashboard. The temperature outside had dropped even further, the Connecticut wind now a predatory force that shook the chassis of the car. But I remained motionless in the driver's seat for 4 hours, the engine idling with a whisper while the heating system struggled to maintain the 72-degree sanctuary I required. My left ear was a map of throbbing pain, the skin around the torn lobe turning a dark, bruised violet that I could see in the vanity mirror. But my hands were perfectly steady as I reached for my MacBook Pro. I flipped the lid, the retina display illuminating the cabin with a clinical white light that felt more honest than any candlelit dinner at the Sterling estate. I bypassed the standard security and pulled up a hidden double-encrypted folder titled Project Solvency, a file I had maintained for a decade, not out of malice, but because a forensic accountant cannot help but track the flow of rot. As I scrolled through the spreadsheets, the true architecture of my exploitation began to crystallize into undeniable figures that screamed louder than my mother's ultimatum. I stared at 96 consecutive monthly payments of $1,250, each one coded as Cassandra's business expenses, which I now knew were nothing more than a cocktail of high-end yoga retreats, organic cold-pressed juice subscriptions, and the maintenance of her spiritual influencer aesthetic. My eyes skipped down to a lump sum entry from 3 years ago, $22,000 for what my father had described as a critical medical emergency involving an experimental cardiac treatment not covered by insurance. I remembered the way my heart had plummeted when he called me, the way I had wired the money within 20 minutes without asking for a single receipt because the thought of losing him was a price I couldn't calculate. 6 months later, I had seen a photograph of a brand-new high-performance Mercury Verado outboard engine on his fishing boat, and when I had asked him about it, he had simply laughed and said he found a deal with the leftovers of his recovery. The grand total sat at the bottom of the column in a bold, unforgiving font, $142,350. This was just the liquid cash, the direct transfers that didn't even account for the property taxes, the catered holidays, or the designer gifts that were thrown back in my face the moment I dared to utter the word no. I sat there in the silence of the rest stop, the only sound the faint hum of the laptop fan and the occasional roar of a semi-truck barreling toward New York, and I realized with a chilling mathematical certainty that I had been the sole financier of my own abuse. I had paid for every slap, every insult, and every moment of exclusion. I had literally bought the mahogany table they used to cast me out. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was a catastrophic investment failure, a decade-long fraud perpetrated by the people who were supposed to be my primary shareholders. I didn't cry because tears are a luxury for those who still believe in a world that makes sense, and as a lead forensic accountant, I knew that a deficit of this magnitude required a total restructuring rather than a temporary emotional outburst. I felt a strange, icy detachment settle over me, the kind of professional focus I utilized when I was hunting down a money launderer's final offshore account. I looked at the $142,000 and, instead of feeling the weight of the loss, I simply adjusted the internal interest rate on my mental spreadsheet to a punitive 15%, compounded annually. I wasn't just going to stop the payments, I was going to perform a hostile takeover of my own life. The screen reflected in my eyes, the lines of data representing a decade of stolen labor and misplaced loyalty. I thought about the way Cassandra's hand felt when it struck me, the weight of the Cartier watch on her wrist providing the momentum, and I realized that every tick of that watch was a second of my life I had given away for free. I thought about my father standing by the open door, letting the 28-degree wind punish me for having boundaries, and I understood that his love was a commodity he only traded when the market was in his favor. For 12 years, I had been the family's private bank, a bottomless reserve of liquidity that required no collateral and offered no resistance, and in the process, I had devalued myself to the point of bankruptcy. The 4 hours I spent at that rest stop were the most productive of my career. I didn't just look at the numbers, I began the systematic process of dismantling the Sterling support system. With a few precise keystrokes, I initiated the closure of the joint account I used to pay the Greenwich Estate's utility bills. The water, the electricity, the heating oil that kept them warm while I sat in the cold. I moved to the Merchant Services portal and flagged the upcoming lease payment for Cassandra's West Village loft as unauthorized, knowing that the landlord's automated system would trigger a late notice within 48 hours. I felt a surge of adrenaline, not from malice, but from the profound satisfaction of finally balancing the books. I looked out the window at the bleak Connecticut landscape, the bare trees looking like skeletal fingers against the dark sky. I realized that the Sterling family didn't just want my money, they wanted the version of me that was small enough to be used. They needed me to be the cold, career-driven one because it excused their own laziness and entitlement. If I was a machine, then machines don't need hugs, machines don't need thanks, and machines certainly don't get to say no. But machines also don't have mercy when the power is cut. I was Vivian Sterling, a woman who had spent her life unearthing the truth behind the numbers, and the truth I found in that rest stop was that I owed them nothing more than a final, audited goodbye. The realization that I had been paying for my own marginalization was a bitter pill, but it was also a vaccine. I would never be infected by their guilt again. I would never again listen to my mother's sighs or my father's emergencies without seeing the boat engine or the boutique shortfalls hidden behind their words. I closed my MacBook with a definitive click that echoed in the quiet car, the sound of a vault locking shut for the final time. I wasn't the daughter they had cast out. I was the creditor they had just defaulted on. I put the car in gear and pulled back onto the highway, the headlights of the Cayenne cutting through the dark with a new, predatory intensity. I didn't need a coat because the fire of my own resolve was finally enough to keep me warm. The path ahead was clear, and for the first time in 45 years, it didn't involve carrying a single person who refused to walk on their own. I was Vivian Sterling, and the interest on what they owed me was about to become the most expensive debt the Sterling family would ever have to pay. Family is a bond, but a bond can be broken when one party fails to meet the terms of the agreement. They had breached the contract of blood, and as I drove toward the skyline of New York, I felt the lightness of a woman who had finally cleared her ledger. The silence of the car was no longer a void. It was a fortress. I thought about the 30 relatives back at the house, still probably sipping the wine I bought, still using the silver I polished, completely unaware that the foundation of their world had just been erased by a woman at a rest stop. I thought about the look on my father's face when the first bill bounced, the way my mother would have to explain to her friends why the wellness retreats had suddenly stopped. I didn't feel joy at the thought of their suffering, but I felt a profound sense of justice. They had mistaken my generosity for weakness and my silence for consent, and they were about to discover that a forensic accountant's greatest skill isn't finding the money, it's knowing exactly how to take it back. As the George Washington Bridge came into view, the lights shimmering like a string of stolen emeralds across the Hudson, I reached up and touched the bruised skin of my ear. The pain was still there, sharp and constant, but it was no longer a sign of my sister's power over me. It was a receipt, a physical record of the moment the Sterling Bank officially ceased operations. I had spent 12 years being the invisible hand that held them up, and as I crossed into Manhattan, I let go. I let go of the house, the shame, the fake holidays, and the daughter who always tried to be enough. I was Vivian Sterling, and I was finally, irrevocably, solvent. My life was no longer a subsidized venture for the ungrateful. It was a private enterprise, and the only person with a seat at my table from now on was the woman who had survived the wind. I didn't need their mahogany table because I had built a skyscraper of my own, and from this height, the Sterling estate looked very, very small. Monday morning arrived with a cold, metallic clarity that mirrored the state of my soul as I stepped out of the elevator on the 42nd floor of a glass and steel monolith in Midtown Manhattan. It was exactly 8:30 a.m. when I walked into the reception area of Thorne, Vance and Associates, an office that smelled of expensive teak wood, Italian leather, and the unspoken power of high-stakes litigation. I was here to see Marcus Thorne, a man known in the legal world as a shark, who specialized in high-net-worth asset recovery and who charged a non-negotiable $650 an hour for the privilege of his undivided attention. I sat in a chair that likely cost more than my first car, my spine perfectly straight, watching the steam rise from a cup of espresso that the receptionist had served in a delicate bone china cup. I was no longer the daughter who paid the bills. I was the lead forensic accountant who had just completed the most thorough audit of her career, and the subject of my investigation was the systematic fraud of the Sterling family. When the heavy, frosted glass door opened and Marcus Thorne motioned me into his inner sanctum, I didn't waste time with pleasantries or the social niceties that had kept me captive for 12 years. I sat across from him at his massive desk, a slab of polished black granite that reflected the morning sun cutting through the Manhattan skyline, and I placed a thick, heavy manila folder on the surface with a definitive thud. Inside were 142 pages of meticulously documented wire transfers, bank statements, and tax filings that traced every cent I had poured into the Sterling abyss. Beside the documents, I placed a high-speed encrypted flash drive containing the 4K dashcam footage from my 2024 Porsche Cayenne, which had captured the entire scene in Greenwich, the high-resolution image of my father, Julian Sterling, hauling my luggage out of the house and throwing it into the accumulating snow while the 28-degree wind whipped through the open door. "I'm not here for a reconciliation, Marcus," I said, my voice as steady and cold as the winter morning outside. "I'm here for a liquidation." I watched his eyes scan the summary sheet I had prepared, his eyebrows rising slightly as he saw the total of $142,350 in direct personal loans, not including the commercial lease obligations for my sister's boutique and her luxury loft. I had been careful over the years. Every time my father or sister asked for a bridge loan or an investment, I had insisted they sign a standard promissory note. They had signed them with a laugh and a dismissive wave of the hand, thinking it was just Vivian being Vivian, never dreaming that the cold, career-driven sister they mocked was actually building a legal fortress around her assets. "I want to trigger the call provision on every single one of these personal loan agreements immediately," I told him, leaning forward so that my reflection in the granite desk became sharper. "Every note contains a clause that allows for immediate repayment in full if there is a material breach of the familial or professional conduct specified in the riders. Assault and illegal eviction qualify." Marcus nodded, a slow, predatory smile touching his lips as he realized I had handed him a closed-loop case. "And regarding the West Village loft," I continued, my mind flicking back to the image of Cassandra's $6,200 Cartier watch. "The lease is in my name, and I am the sole guarantor. I want the termination executed for illegal subletting and damage to the property's financial standing. Most importantly, I want the eviction notice served by a sheriff in a marked car in broad daylight so that every one of her spiritual influencer neighbors can see exactly how her manifestation of abundance ends." I spent the next hour walking Marcus through the technical specifications of the Sterling downfall. We looked at the deeds to the property in Greenwich, noting the secondary liens I had quietly purchased from the original lenders to prevent my father from losing the house to strangers, liens that I now controlled as the primary creditor. We analyzed the boutique's financial records, which showed a pattern of embezzlement from the business accounts for personal luxuries, a fact that would make Cassandra's defense in a civil suit nearly impossible. Every detail was a brick being removed from the foundation of their lives. I felt no hesitation, no pang of guilt, and no desire for a last-minute apology. The time for apologies had expired the moment the earring snapped and the blood began to trickle down my neck. The technical precision of the meeting was therapeutic. We discussed the service of process for the summons and complaint, the filing fees, and the specific timing of the bank account freezes. I instructed Marcus to notify the utility companies that the primary account holder was withdrawing responsibility for the Greenwich estate, meaning the heat, water, and electricity would be disconnected within 72 hours unless my parents could produce the 5-figure deposits required for new accounts, money I knew they didn't have. I was stripping away the illusions of wealth I had provided, leaving them with nothing but the raw, cold reality of their own insolvency. As I sat there, watching Marcus Thorne make notes in the margins of my audit, I realized that I had spent my entire adult life trying to be the good daughter, the one who absorbed the blows and balanced the books so the family could remain intact. But a family held together only by the constant infusion of one person's capital is not a family. It is a parasitic organism. By removing the host, I wasn't just getting revenge, I was restoring the natural order of things. If my father wanted me to be a guest, he would now have to learn what it was like to be a guest in a home he no longer owned. If my sister wanted to be an influencer, she would now have the opportunity to influence her followers on the reality of being homeless in Manhattan. The weight of the $142,000 was no longer a burden on my shoulders. It was a weapon in my hand. I thought about the 30 relatives at the dinner table, the ones who sat in silence while I was struck and cast out, and I felt a profound sense of closure. They had chosen their side, and now they would have to live with the consequences of an empty bank and a cold house. Marcus looked up from the file, his expression one of professional admiration. "You've done 90% of the work for me, Vivian. This isn't a lawsuit, it's a controlled demolition." "Exactly," I replied, standing up and smoothing the fabric of my charcoal gray wool trousers. "I want the first notices served by tomorrow afternoon. I want them to understand that the holiday spirit they accused me of suffocating is gone, replaced by the cold, hard reality of a forensic audit." I walked out of his office, the click of my heels on the marble floor sounding like the final strike of a gavel. I stepped back into the elevator, the doors closing with a whisper, and as I descended toward the street level, I felt a strange sense of peace. I was Vivian Sterling, 45 years old, and I had finally learned that the most important person to account for in any ledger is yourself. As I stepped out onto the busy Manhattan sidewalk, the morning air was crisp and biting, but I didn't feel the cold. I walked toward a small, high-end cafe around the corner, the kind of place where the baristas knew the difference between an Arabica and a Robusta bean, and I ordered a simple black coffee. I sat by the window, watching the throngs of people rushing toward their own lives, their own debts, and their own secrets. I pulled my phone out and deleted the group chat titled Sterling Family, the thread disappearing from my screen with a simple swipe of my thumb. I was no longer an emergency contact. I was no longer a benefactor. I was no longer a sister or a daughter in the way they defined those terms. I looked at my reflection in the window of the cafe, seeing a woman whose face was still slightly bruised but whose eyes were clearer than they had been in a decade. The cost of my freedom had been high, $142,000 and a shattered pearl earring, but as I sipped my coffee, I knew it was the best investment I had ever made. Family isn't blood. Family is a contract of mutual respect and protection, and when one side breaches that contract, the only logical move is to terminate the agreement. I had spent 12 years being the invisible hand that held up a crumbling empire, but tonight, I would sleep in a penthouse that was mine, in a life that was mine, knowing that the only person I was responsible for was the woman staring back at me in the glass. The Sterling Bank was not just closed. It was being liquidated, and the only person walking away with a profit was the one they had left standing in the wind. Exactly 14 days had passed since the night I was cast out into the 28-degree Connecticut wind, and the Sterling estate was once again a glowing beacon of manufactured perfection, hosting a Christmas preview party that smelled of pine needles, expensive catering, and the desperate, cloying scent of a legacy on life support. There were 55 guests in attendance, the circular driveway choked with European luxury SUVs and high-end sedans, while inside, a $3,000 professional catering team from Greenwich moved like clockwork, serving smoked salmon blinis and flutes of Veuve Clicquot to a crowd that had no idea the floor beneath their feet was legally shifting. My sister Cassandra was the center of attention, floating through the foyer in a brand-new $2,500 Dior sleeveless cocktail dress in a shade of midnight blue that she surely believed projected an image of serene abundance, her $6,000 Cartier watch glinting under the glare of the Austrian crystal chandeliers. She was playing the part of the successful heiress, laughing with the same relatives who had watched her strike me 2 weeks prior, oblivious to the fact that the legal machinery I had set in motion with Marcus Thorne was already grinding toward its inevitable conclusion. I arrived at exactly 8:45 p.m., pulling my Porsche Cayenne into the shadows at the edge of the property, the engine's low hum a stark contrast to the festive music drifting from the open windows of the mansion. I didn't come bearing festively wrapped boxes from Bergdorf Goodman or vintage bottles of wine. I stepped out of the car, wearing a $1,800 charcoal pinstripe suit from Theory, tailored to a surgical fit that made me feel more like an auditor of souls than a daughter of the house. In my right hand, I carried a slim, pebble-grain leather briefcase containing 45 meticulously bound copies of what I had titled the Family Financial Transparency Report, a document I had spent 80 hours perfecting on 80-pound high-grade bond paper that felt heavy and authoritative in the hand. I walked up the stone steps, my heels striking the pavement with a rhythmic military precision, and I entered the house without knocking, the warm air of the party hitting my face like a physical weight. The music didn't stop immediately, but the atmosphere in the foyer changed the moment I stepped into the light, the laughter of Aunt Margaret and Cousin Julian dying in their throats as they saw the bruise on my ear had faded into a cold, hard resolve. My mother, Eleanor, approached me with a glass of champagne in her hand, her eyes darting to the briefcase with a mixture of fear and aristocratic disdain. "Vivian, you weren't invited to this preview and certainly not dressed for a board meeting," she whispered, her voice tight with the strain of maintaining the facade in front of the local country club set. I didn't answer her. I simply walked past her toward the center of the great room, where my father was holding court near the fireplace, a glass of 30-year-old scotch in his hand. I opened my briefcase with 2 sharp metallic clicks that seemed to echo above the chatter of the 55 guests, and I began to distribute the reports with the same efficiency I used when handing out evidence during a corporate fraud trial. I didn't say a word as I placed the heavy, professional documents into the hands of my relatives, watching their faces turn from confusion to absolute horror as they opened the first page to see a color-coded bar chart of the $142,350 in unpaid personal loans I had extended to the people in this room. The report was a masterpiece of forensic accounting, detailed down to the cent, including the $22,000 medical emergency that had actually purchased a boat engine and the 96 consecutive payments for Cassandra's spiritual lifestyle. I made sure each copy included the high-resolution 4K still from my dash cam, the image of my father throwing my luggage into the snow, printed with a clarity that made the cruelty of the moment undeniable to even the most loyal family sycophant. Cassandra rushed over, her Dior dress swishing aggressively, her face a mask of panicked rage as she saw the financial transparency report in the hands of a prominent local real estate developer she had been trying to impress. "What is this, Vivian? You're insane! You're ruining everything over a stupid misunderstanding," she hissed, her voice cracking as she realized the document in his hand also contained a copy of the eviction notice that would be served to her West Village loft by a sheriff the following morning. I looked at her, seeing not a sister, but a liability that had finally been called due. "It's not a misunderstanding, Cassandra. It's an audit," I replied, my voice carrying just enough to be heard by the surrounding guests. "I'm simply letting the family know that the bank is closed and that the holiday spirit you all value so much has been subsidized by the very person you saw fit to strike and exile." My father approached, his face a deep mottled red that matched the mahogany trim of the room, the scotch in his glass sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "Get out of my house, Vivian, before I have you removed," he growled. But the threat lacked its previous power because he knew, as I did, that the property tax lien I had purchased meant he was essentially shouting at his new landlord. I stood my ground, the pinstripe suit feeling like armor, and I leaned in close enough to smell the expensive peat of his drink. "It's not your house anymore, Dad. You haven't paid the taxes in 2 years, and the call provision I triggered this morning means you owe me the full balance of the mortgage bridge by the end of the business week, or the foreclosure proceedings Marcus Thorne initiated will become public record." The silence that finally enveloped the room was absolute, a stark contrast to the $3,000 catering team's frantic efforts to continue serving hors d'oeuvres in the kitchen. The 55 guests were no longer looking at the Christmas tree or the Dior dress. They were staring at the numbers on the high-grade bond paper, seeing the Sterling family for exactly what they were, a collection of beautiful, expensive shells with nothing inside but debt and resentment. I watched as my mother sank into a velvet armchair, the champagne glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the hardwood, the sound a perfect punctuation mark to the end of an era. I didn't feel the need to shout or to cry or to demand an apology that would have been as counterfeit as their lifestyle. I had provided the truth, and in the world of forensic accounting, the truth is the only currency that never devalues. I turned and walked toward the door, leaving 45 copies of their shame scattered across the mahogany tables and the silk-upholstered chairs. As I stepped back out into the cool December night, the Connecticut air felt fresh and clean, devoid of the cloying sense of the party. I climbed into my Porsche and sat for a moment, looking at the house in the rearview mirror. For 12 years, I had been the silent foundation of that building, holding up the walls while the people inside tried to crush me with their expectations. Now, the foundation was gone, and I could already see the cracks beginning to spread through the lit windows. "My name is Vivian Sterling. I am 45 years old, and as I drove away from the Christmas preview, I realized that the greatest gift I had ever given myself was the courage to stop paying for my own destruction. Family is often touted as the one thing you can never lose, but that is a lie designed to keep the exploited in their place. Family is a structure that requires maintenance, honesty, and mutual investment, and when those things are replaced by theft and violence, the structure becomes a cage. I had spent $142,000 to learn that I was worth more than the sum of my bank accounts. I had spent a decade being the cold sister so they could be the warm ones. But as I headed toward the city, I knew that the fire I had started with those 45 reports would be the only thing keeping them warm this winter. I was no longer a Sterling in the way they defined it. I was an independent entity, fully solvent and entirely free. The weight of the leather briefcase beside me was gone, replaced by a lightness in my chest that no amount of money could buy. I thought about the sheriff who would be arriving at Cassandra's loft in less than 12 hours, and the utility workers who would be disconnecting the power to the Greenwich estate by Thursday. It wasn't about revenge, it was about the restoration of a balanced ledger. They had taken my kindness and recorded it as a weakness, and I had simply corrected the entry. As the lights of the Merritt Parkway blurred into long ribbons of white and red, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The audit was complete, the assets were recovered, and the woman who had walked out into the wind without a coat was finally, for the first time in her life, coming home to herself. The moral of the Sterling story is that you cannot build a life on the backs of the people you refuse to see. You cannot demand loyalty from the person you treat as a commodity, and you certainly cannot expect the bank to stay open once you've proven you have no intention of honoring the debt. I had been the family's private bank, their forensic expert, and their silent savior. But tonight, I was just Vivian. And Vivian was more than enough. As I reached the limits of the city, the skyline rising up to meet me like a promise kept, I turned off my phone and let the silence of the drive wash over me. The holiday spirit was finally dead, and in its place was something much more valuable: the truth. And the truth, I realized as I looked at the bruised ear in the mirror one last time, was the only thing I had ever truly inherited. The Sterling name was a bankrupt brand, and I was moving on to a much better venture, my own life. The timing was as calculated as a tax audit, a surgical strike delivered precisely as the catering staff began to present the main course, a dry-aged prime rib roast that smelled of rosemary and unearned privilege. I waited until the 55 guests had their plates in front of them, their crystal glasses refilled with the vintage wine I would never pay for again. And then I stood up with a slow, deliberate grace that drew every eye in the great room toward me. I reached out and tapped the side of my wine glass with a sterling silver spoon, the sharp, crystalline chime cutting through the hum of practiced laughter and the clinking of expensive cutlery like a fire alarm in a cathedral. My mother froze with a piece of artisan bread halfway to her lips, and my father's grip tightened on his Scotch glass, his knuckles turning a waxy white that matched the linen napkins. I looked directly at Cassandra, who was preening in her midnight blue Dior dress, basking in the attention of a local gallery owner, and I let a cold, clinical smile touch my lips, a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Since my sister believes so fervently in the power of sharing energy and the universal flow of abundance, I thought it was only fitting that we, as a family, finally share some data, I said, my voice projecting with the practiced clarity of a lead auditor addressing a board of directors. The room went unnervingly still, the kind of silence that precedes a structural collapse. I opened my pebble-grain leather briefcase and began the methodical distribution of the family financial transparency reports, moving from table to table with a calm, predatory efficiency. I didn't rush. I wanted them to feel the weight of the 80-pound bond paper in their hands, to see the professional binding, and to understand that what they were holding was not a holiday greeting, but a forensic autopsy of the Sterling family's integrity. Each page was a masterpiece of cold, hard facts, listing the exact dates, the precise dollar amounts, and the supposedly desperate purposes of every single cent I had poured into their parasitic lifestyles over the last 12 years. $142,350, I announced to the silent room, the number hanging in the air like a physical weight that made the guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. I watched as Great Aunt Martha adjusted her spectacles to stare at a bar chart detailing the $6,200 Cartier watch on Cassandra's wrist, which was cross-referenced with the 3-month soul-searching trip I had been asked to fund just weeks ago. The only sound in the cavernous room was the staccato rhythm of silver hitting porcelain plates as shocked guests dropped their forks, the music of their shared embarrassment playing perfectly into my hands. I moved toward the head of the table where my father sat, his face a deepening shade of mahogany that mirrored the furniture he could no longer afford. With a hand that was perfectly steady, I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a final blue-backed legal document, a formal foreclosure notice on the secondary property in Greenwich that I technically owned through a shell corporation I had established to protect the family's assets years ago. I laid the document directly on his gold-rimmed dinner plate, covering the prime rib and the red wine reduction with the cold, black ink of his own failure. "Happy holidays, Dad," I whispered, the words carrying just far enough for the surrounding relatives to catch the sharp edge of the irony. Cassandra finally broke her stunned silence, her face contorting into a mask of hysterical entitlement that shattered her carefully curated spiritual persona. She stood up so violently that her chair tipped over, her hand flying to her throat as if to protect the invisible emeralds she had planned to steal. She tried to scream, her mouth opening to deliver one of her practiced monologues about family loyalty and negative energy, but I didn't give her the chance to breathe. I reached back into the briefcase and held up a formal cease and desist order, signed by Marcus Thorne and stamped with the seal of the New York State Bar, specifically regarding Grandmother Beatrice's vintage emerald necklace. "Don't even bother, Cassandra," I said, my voice dropping into a low, dangerous register that silenced her mid-gasp. "The deed of gift is filed, the theft is documented, and if you so much as mention that necklace to a jeweler, the sheriff waiting at your West Village loft tomorrow morning will have an additional warrant for your arrest." I looked around the room at the 30 relatives who had enjoyed my largesse for a decade while treating me like an emotional leper. I saw the fear in their eyes, the sudden realization that the cold, career-driven Vivian they had mocked was the only thing that had kept the roof over their heads and the wine in their glasses. I had spent 12 years being their silent financier, their invisible support system, and their favorite punching bag. But tonight, I was the only person in the room with a positive balance. I felt a profound sense of relief, a shedding of the heavy, suffocating skin of the good daughter that had nearly cost me my soul. The contrast between the opulence of the room, the $3,000 catering, the Dior dress, the flickering Joe Malone candles, and the raw, jagged reality of the financial report was a masterclass in hyperrealism. I watched my mother's hand tremble as she reached for her wine, her fingers fumbling with the $65 crystal glass until it tipped, the dark red liquid soaking into the $5,000 tablecloth like a spreading, irreversible stain. It was the perfect metaphor for the Sterling legacy. Expensive, curated, and currently bleeding out in front of 55 witnesses. I stood at the center of the wreckage I had created, feeling the 28-degree wind of the previous week finally being replaced by the internal heat of my own liberation. I had been 45 years old when they threw me out into the snow, but in this moment, I felt as if I were finally being born into a world where I didn't owe a single person an apology for my success. I looked at my father, whose eyes were fixed on the foreclosure notice with a hollow, haunted expression. He knew the numbers didn't lie. He knew the call provision I had triggered was a financial death sentence for his lifestyle. He had opened the door to the cold for me, thinking I would crawl back with a checkbook and a plea for forgiveness. But he had forgotten that I was the one who taught the world how to track the money. "You told me that if I couldn't be a sister, I couldn't be a guest," I said, my voice steady as I snapped the locks on my briefcase. "You were right, Dad. I'm not a guest, I'm the creditor. And since the holiday spirit is so important to this family, consider this my contribution, the gift of total, unvarnished honesty." I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need to hear their excuses or their sudden, desperate attempts at reconciliation. I turned and walked through the foyer, my heels clicking on the marble floors with a finality that sounded like a vault door closing for the last time. I passed the catering staff, who were standing frozen in the hallway, and I walked out into the Connecticut night. The air was frigid, the stars sharp and cold above the sprawling estate, but I didn't shiver. I climbed into the Cayenne, the leather seats welcoming me into a sanctuary that I had earned and that I alone controlled. As I pulled out of the driveway, the headlights swept across the mansion, illuminating the cracks in the stone that no one had bothered to fix because they were too busy spending my money on silk and scotch. I drove away from the $142,350 of debt, from the bruised ear, and from the girl who thought she could buy her father's love with a property tax payment. Family is the story we tell ourselves until we are strong enough to tell the truth. For the Sterlings, the story was one of heritage and grace, but the truth was a spreadsheet of theft and a 4K video of a man throwing his daughter into the snow. I had spent 12 years being the secret foundation of a lie, and tonight I had simply removed myself from the equation. As the distance between me and the estate grew, The high-pitched ringing in my left ear finally stopped, replaced by the rhythmic, soothing hum of the Porsche's engine. I was Vivian Sterling, lead forensic accountant, and I had just closed the most expensive account of my life. The price of admission to their world had been my dignity, and tonight I had finally demanded a full refund, with 15% interest compounded by the weight of every silent tear I had ever shed. I was heading toward New York, toward my penthouse, and toward a future where the only person I had to account for was the woman who had survived the wind. The Bank of Vivian Sterling was officially, permanently, and gloriously out of business, and as the lights of the highway blurred into a golden trail, I realized that the only thing more powerful than a daughter who says yes is a woman who finally, irrevocably, says no. Today, I live in a state of profound and hard-won tranquility within the walls of my quiet, debt-free penthouse on the Upper West Side, a sanctuary of high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooks the rhythmic pulse of Manhattan without being consumed by it. The air here is thin and clean, smelling of nothing but the expensive white tea from my Breville precision brewer and the faint, comforting scent of old books bound in leather. In this space, the ghost of Vivian Sterling, the woman who served as a human ATM for 12 years, has been exorcised, replaced by a woman who understands that her value is not a line item on someone else's balance sheet. My digital life is as fortified as my physical one. I have configured a series of sophisticated email filters that automatically intercept any message containing the words mom, dad, or help, sending them directly to the trash without ever alerting my phone. There is a cold, mathematical peace in knowing that their desperation can no longer reach me, that the emotional malware they use to infect my life has been permanently quarantined and deleted by the very logic they once mocked. The fallout of the Sterling collapse was as total and uncompromising as the forensic audit that triggered it, leaving a trail of shattered illusions in its wake. Cassandra, the former spiritual influencer who once lived in a $4,100 a month luxury loft on my dime, has been forced into a reality that no amount of manifestation can fix. She now resides in a damp 300-square-foot basement apartment in a far less prestigious corner of Queens, a space where the ceiling pipes hum with the waste of people more successful than her, and the single window looks out onto the grime of a concrete alley. To avoid the final ignominy of a bankruptcy filing that would permanently destroy her remaining credit, she is currently working 50 hours a week at a high-volume call center. Her voice, once used to preach about the universe's abundance, now reduced to reading scripts for a debt consolidation firm for $22 an hour. The $6,200 Cartier watch I bought her was the first thing to go, sold to a luxury reseller for a fraction of its value just to cover the security deposit on her new, cramped reality. My parents, Julian and Eleanor, have discovered that the cost of their betrayal was far higher than the $52,000 property tax bill I refused to pay. To satisfy the call provision on the $142,350 in emergency loans I demanded back in full, they were forced to sell their beloved vacation home in Newport, Rhode Island, the shingle-style cottage where they spent decades pretending to be wealthier than they were. The mahogany table around which 30 relatives sat while I was struck has been sold, along with the $65 crystal glasses and the silver flatware, all liquidated to settle the debts they had accumulated while they were busy casting me out into the wind. They live now in a modest 2-bedroom condo, the heat kept at a sensible 68 degrees because there is no longer a daughter to quietly absorb the overages, and the silence in their home is no longer the silence of prestige, but the hollow quiet of people who finally realized they traded their only true asset for a boat engine and a Dior dress. I didn't lose a family. I performed a long overdue amputation of a gangrenous limb, and in doing so, I saved my own life. I gained a fortune not just in the hundreds of thousands of dollars I will never again waste on their ungrateful whims, but in the priceless currency of my own sanity and self-respect. Every morning, I wake up at 5 a.m., not out of a frantic need to outwork their demands, but because I enjoy the clarity of the dawn and the knowledge that every minute of my day belongs exclusively to me. I run 6 miles along the Hudson River, the wind no longer a punishment but a companion, and I return to a home where no one is waiting to slap me for saying no. My career as a lead forensic accountant continues to flourish, but I no longer bring the stress of the office home. I have learned to audit my relationships with the same cold precision I apply to corporate ledgers, cutting losses the moment the interest on my emotional investment turns negative. The bruise on my left ear has long since healed, leaving no physical scar, but the memory remains a vital part of my internal architecture, a reminder of the exact moment I stopped being a victim and started being a victor. I look at the 4K dashcam footage occasionally, not to dwell on the pain, but to witness the birth of my own freedom, watching the woman in the Porsche drive away from the shadows of the Sterling estate and into the light of her own making. I have realized that family is not a biological mandate, but a voluntary association based on mutual respect, protection, and a shared commitment to the truth. Anyone who fails to meet those criteria is merely a stranger who shares your DNA. My name is Vivian Sterling. I am 45 years old, and for the first time in my existence, I am entirely and gloriously solvent in every sense of the word. The mahogany tables and the artisan sourdough are gone, replaced by a life of authentic simplicity and unshakable boundaries that no one will ever again be allowed to breach. I spend my evenings in my leather chair, reading by the light of a single high-end floor lamp, the only sound the soft turning of pages and the distant, muffled heartbeat of the city I have conquered on my own terms. I have built a fortress of my own making, one that doesn't require a $65 wine glass to feel like a home. I am the architect of my own peace, the auditor of my own soul, and the sole beneficiary of a life lived without the suffocating weight of unearned obligation. The Sterling Bank is not just closed, it has been dissolved, and the woman who emerged from the wreckage is more formidable, more focused, and more alive than the daughter they tried to break. I think back to the 28-degree wind in Connecticut and the sound of my father closing the door, and I feel a profound sense of gratitude for his cruelty. If he hadn't been so absolute in his rejection, I might have spent another 12 years trying to buy their love, slowly drowning in a sea of subsidized excuses and hidden debts. His slap was the wake-up call I didn't know I needed, the violent catalyst that forced me to look at the numbers and realize that I was being robbed of my time, my money, and my dignity. By throwing me out, he gave me the one thing I could never have bought for myself, the realization that I didn't need them to survive. I was the one who was necessary to their survival, and in removing myself, I restored the balance of power to its rightful owner. Today, my life is a masterpiece of efficiency and joy, a testament to the power of a woman who knows her worth and refuses to negotiate it. I have friends now who don't know the balance of my bank account, people who love me for my sharp wit and my quiet strength rather than the favors I can do for them. We eat simple meals on mismatched plates, and the laughter in my kitchen is real, unforced, and entirely free. I have found a family in the strangers I met along the way, in the colleagues who respected my boundaries, and in the woman I saw in the mirror the night I drove away from Greenwich. My name is Vivian Sterling, and I am finally home, sitting in a quiet, debt-free space where the only energy being shared is the peaceful, steady glow of a life finally well-lived. Family isn't blood. Family is the people who stay when the checks stop clearing and the lights go out. It is the people who see you standing in the wind and offer you their own coat, not the ones who take yours because they think they deserve it more. I have audited my life, I have cut my losses, and the profit I have gained is a future that belongs to no one but me. As the sun sets over the Hudson, casting a long golden shadow across my living room, I realize that the most successful merger I ever managed was the one where I joined my past strength with my present freedom. I am Vivian Sterling, and the account of my life is finally, beautifully, perfectly balanced. The moral of my story is that the greatest fortune you will ever own is the one you find when you stop paying for other people's lies and start investing in your own truth. Sanity is the highest form of wealth, and after 45 years, I am the richest woman I know.